The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the honourable member for Chifley.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I just want to pick up on a point the member for Boothby said, that the internet poses challenges in this area. Yeah, it does. But the big challenge is the reform, the freeing up of copyright to ensure that innovation can spread more widely, and to face up to big rights holders and the type of hysterical arguments we get in this space, where if as lawmakers we get a selfie with Richard Roxburgh — I love Rake as much as anyone else, but just because you get a selfie with Richard Roxburgh, or maybe a political party gets a donation out of a rights holder, does not mean that we should stop from looking at how to make the type of reforms that balance out the needs of creatives, the needs of producers versus the needs of consumers. And this bill, which I absolutely support — I mean, no one supports piracy. No one should support piracy. Piracy is theft. I totally get that, and we support this bill. But the problem is the rights holders refuse. Bloated, greedy, resistant to change rights holders will always refuse to reform in this space. They will always want and copyright reform is used as their way to shield themselves from the modern era, to shield themselves from new ways of doing things. The internet is not a challenge to rights holders. The mentality of rights holders to move with the times is the biggest challenge to rights holders in this country. And piracy is their go-to lever. Whenever they want to resist change, we're all about fighting pirates. Apparently there are pirates all over the place that we've got to be watching out for, that are ready to rip people off, that are demonising these hard-working rights holders. We get this argument all the time. What they think is that by constantly using legal mechanisms through this place and elsewhere, that piracy will disappear. The reality is piracy is a reflection of a market failure. I do not excuse, condone or support piracy, but I do recognise that it is a reflection of market failure, where providers, producers, are making an offering that is not in line with consumer expectation, and the access is not in line with consumer expectation. So these type of bills that the rights holders all champion and support and claim credit for, I mean, what we are providing for here is a form of sort of regulatory hallucinogen, where they think that if they get this type of regulatory reform through, that piracy will disappear. No, it won't. Until rights holders get serious about the consumer offering and the way in which they're helping consumers access content in a much more affordable way, that will have a bigger impact. And this isn't some sort of highfalutin, some sort of utopic view about this. The reality is utopian. Thank you, Minister. The reality is, if you've looked in times past, where there was piracy enabled through file-sharing platforms, you had the rise of Steve Jobs, Apple and the iPod, then leading to the creation of iTunes, and their pricing structure for music basically made a consumer think deeply about whether or not they would take pirated content with all its risks of malware and piracy and copyright breach versus the simple process of buying a single at 99 cents through iTunes. So the proposition was changed, that the rights holders, if you look at the history of this, even resisted Steve Jobs initially, but then ceded way for him because they figured Apple at that point in time, their market share was so small, why bother? But they also had the pressure that was coming from a firm called Napster that had opened up access to music in a way that had never been there before. When the member for Boothby talks about Spotify or someone else talks about iTunes, just know the only reason those things existed was because Napster created the pressure on rights holders to reconsider their offering and the way that they did things. and all the innovation that flowed through improving file transfer over communication networks, that all happened because a bunch of teenagers in the other side of the Pacific thought differently about the way they would spread content. But it would never have happened with rights holders, because they just want to maintain the existing arrangements to squeeze the maximum amount they can out of consumers. So in this debate, I speak as someone who's standing up for consumers. I don't speak for this pro-producer legislation per se. I do support its ability to crack down on piracy, absolutely. But I think the voice of consumers needs to be heard more. And we'll have people who will argue passionately for this, but will also argue at the same time we need trade liberalisation. I mean, the Coalition argues all the time, and I think in this House there are massive benefits, and I am a supporter of trade liberalisation. My role is consistent. My arguments in these cases are consistent. Opening systems up has delivered benefits to economies and communities. The old way of always dragging down on the regulatory lever to see certain things occur, that has short-term benefit, long-term loss. Trade liberalisation opened things up. So if you're in favour of trade liberalisation, you can't argue against the type of refusal to reform copyright in the way that we hear is often being advanced. I mean, the Coalition do this, bring forward this type of legislation, because they don't have the guts to stand up to the rights holders. They will not stand up to the rights holders on key reforms in copyright like safe harbours. Safe harbour reform, too hard for them. They will not argue it, because the big rights holders continually beat down on any move to open up in this space. Yeah, and some of these rights holders, the arguments that they use are incredible. I mean, Graham Burke from Village Roadshow likened Google to big tobacco. That's what Graham Burke said as a rights holder. It's embarrassing that that is the level of advocacy by rights holders, but this is what these people think. This bill will allow what Graham Burke and all the others want, which is if other countries in the world can curate what you find on a search engine, we should be able to do it too, but for rights holders. That's what they press for. This is the type of argument that's been put forward. And they want someone else to pick up the bill, be it a telco that has to respond to a court case where someone is launched as a rights holder, this type of thing. They'll do that. The rights holders want their rights defended, they want other people in the economy and the business community to pay for it, and they want consumers to have less choice. And in the meantime, technology advances to such a point that it renders those business models obsolete. As I said, no one supports piracy, but I don't support regulatory hallucinogens like this, where they just think that if they clamp down on piracy, that their need to reform their business model goes away. Wrong. You know, there are some big rights holders who fight modernity, who want to see everything on the internet have a dollar sign in front of it or content to constantly sit behind a paywall, and then have that offering out of step with what consumers are prepared to pay for. Let me give you an example. Most online media subscriptions will cost you anywhere between $25 to $30. You can go onto Spotify and get subscription to all the music you want for $12 a month, half of that. So I have to pay $30 for 30, maybe 30, 35 issues of news content through News Limited. Well, it's 32. I don't want to mislead the House. Versus what you get on other offerings. Now, there is a rightful case to be said about the way in which the model may be undermining the ability for us to have quality journalism, and I totally get that. And that is a right argument. And there are also people that argue against Spotify not providing for artists the income levels that they need, and I think that is a fair argument too and needs to be had. But we don't shut down the platform because it threatens a right holder's model. And I'll argue this case consistently. Just like I said a few moments ago, trade liberalisation and opening up these pathways, very important. We did this through the Hawke-Keating years, of opening up the economy. We had a lot of people, particularly those that we represent here, that were impacted on by those reforms. We didn't say we won't do it because it'll have that negative impact. We look at the transition on the way through. And I don't argue this with any vested interest either. Just like when my side of politics said we're going to change negative gearing rules, I didn't say, well, I've got an investment property and therefore I'm not in favour of negative gearing reform. Like, I never said that. And I think it is important to reform negative gearing. And it is important to open up the economy. And it's also important, and I challenge rights holders and those in the creative community to say, why is it that you're resistant to reform, but everyone else in the economy has to go through it, changing the way that they work, providing for lower cost in the system, providing for a better form of remuneration down the track through changing the way that those systems operate. Those are the things that should be looked at, not us being used in this chamber to advance commercial interests for people who refuse to move with the times, which is exactly what we get when it comes to copyright. The failure of this place to be able to see genuine reform on safe harbours, where new digital platforms are emerging in this country, created by business people in this country, that provide a new way for artists and manufacturers alike to be able to create a new income flow, and we say it's too hard to have the legal sword that hangs over their head because someone in any part of the world, in the case of Redbubble, as I've previously told the House, being challenged by Hell's Angels and taken to court by Hell's Angels because the Hell's Angels thought their copyright had been breached by Redbubble operating out of Melbourne and providing hundreds of jobs and huge economic opportunities for content generators, artists and the like. That's what exists. Redbubble, that was taken on by Sony because of apparent breaches to Pokemon, the legal case was upheld and Redbubble was charged the princely sum of $1 as a fine by the court because Redbubble had a whole series of mechanisms in place to be able to respond to concerns about copyright breach and to ensure that ours were looked after. We need to find a way in copyright reform to protect artists rightly and their income and livelihood, but also allow other innovative companies the way forward to be able to generate, through innovative ideas, new ways of getting things done, create commercial value in the growth of those firms, Redbubble, Envato, 99 Designs and the like, to be able to have those firms and platforms thrive, survive and grow. And that's what should happen. Like I said, by all means, let's support this bill, but let's not support this sort of camouflaging of reality that exists where the rights holders don't do anything about their business model. They just ring the bell and get us to rush in here with another bill about piracy while they don't actually keep step with modern times. It's just inconceivable that we continue to allow this to occur. Again, if we clamp down on piracy in the way that we're doing it, we need to see an equal effort by rights holders to demonstrate how they are offering new ways of getting things done, providing accessible content, affordable content to users, because if they don't do it, other market providers in other parts of the world are going to do it, and our people, consumers, Australians, will find a way around it. I mean, I imagine at some point we're going to have the debate in here about banning VPNs because they allow people to access content on other sides of the planet that aren't being able to be accessed here. I mean, at what point do we see the rights holders make that argument? I wouldn't be surprised if we see it soon. If we got some rights holders saying Google's as bad as big tobacco, I don't hesitate to think that they'll come back with that proposition. Again, we've got to find a way to protect and enhance artists' income, but also allow other innovation to occur in the Australian economy without always having this binary debate that says copyright reform is completely bad and can never be countenanced. It's just not sustainable.